All right, let's go ahead and jump on into it. So, hey, thanks for joining everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Krabon. I'm a partner here at Capco within data and analytics, representing the U.S. business. For those unfamiliar, Capco is a global management consulting and advisory firm focused on financial services. Our data and analytics practice happens to go to market with a capability called data privacy and security, of which our topic today, third-party risk management, is a pretty integral piece. So I'm personally excited about the topic, reinventing third-party risk management, and I'm really excited about the panel that's joining us today to have what should be an enthralling and deep conversation around TPRM. So with that, I'll just give a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So we'll be talking about the strategic advantage of a data-centric, privacy-aware approach to TPRM. We'll be talking about how to visualize and understand data sprawl across the service provider landscape. We'll be investigating how we assess threats and risks presented by TPRM providers and how this informs risk mitigation decisions. And then finally, we'll learn about automation and enterprise tools like OneTrust that help us with intake, risk assessments, mitigation, ongoing monitoring, and reporting. As we go through the webinar today, we're going to have an opportunity to do some polls. We'd like to get a little bit of perspective and maybe interest from the audience. So look out for those, and we'll kind of start off with a poll here in a second. But right now, what I'd like to do is go ahead and introduce our esteemed panel who'll be joining us today. And I will go ahead and tee it up for Nick Geyer from OneTrust to give a quick intro.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for having me. My name is Nick Geyer. I'm a senior product marketing manager on the technical product side for our third-party risk management solutions at OneTrust. So I sit kind of right in that middle ground between product and our marketing and sales orgs for kind of figuring out what we need to bring to market to best support our customers, best solve new challenges that are being faced within the risk management landscape, and kind of being that interface back and forth. So I've been at OneTrust for about 2 years now and really excited for the panel.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. Emily.
Hi, thanks for having me. As for my background, I'm currently the head of privacy at a company called Tenuity, which is an advertising agency and ad tech company. As for my background, I'm a lawyer with a heavy focus on compliance and technology. I spent a number of years primarily in technology contracting and procurement, and then about 8 years ago, I shifted over to doing privacy full-time. While I'm currently in advertising, my career has spanned across financial services, IT and cloud services, data and logistics. And I tend to really focus in on that intersection of privacy, data, and risk, and in general, look to take a data-driven approach to privacy problems. And it's a pleasure to be here today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emily. Thanks for being here. And last but not least, Andy.
Hi, my name is Andy Sudek. I'm a managing principal here at Capco in the data security and privacy practice. We've done a fair number of third-party risk management projects over the last few years. Increasing regulations across the financial sector have really driven intense need to get on top of these privacy and security risks. And I'm glad to be here and look forward to this discussion. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all three, and really looking forward to the conversation today. I think we've got a really good set of topics to cover, and really interested in everyone's perspective on all of those. So as promised, we are actually going to do a quick poll question, and this will be fairly quick and painless, so please do take a look. The first question we're going to have is, how mature is your organization's approach to integrating privacy by design into third-party risk management? I'm going to go ahead and give 30 seconds for everyone to go ahead and respond back to that, and then we'll take a quick look at the responses, and then we'll move on into our agenda. So if you take a quick second, about 30 seconds or so, we'll go ahead and collect those poll responses. All right, looks like we've got some responses back in, with our two front runner responses being, we've got some practices in place, but there's room for improvement. So that's completely understandable in this space. And then the next being, we follow well-established privacy by design principles across our TPRM program. Fantastic. So very few people, it looks like, are just getting started. So this should be a interesting conversation for those of you that are off to the races in your TPRM program. So good insights, and thank you for that response. So with that, we'll go ahead and move into our first topic, and that is talking about the discovery of a strategic advantage of a data-centric, privacy-aware approach to TPRM. So my first question will be to you, Emily. If you can take us through your thoughts around how does privacy by design intersect with TPRM, and why is this integration essential for modern risk management?
Absolutely. So I view TPRM as an inherent part of privacy by design, and privacy by design processes as a valuable input into TPRM. I tend to think of privacy by design as the practice of identifying and implementing risk-appropriate privacy considerations as you're designing and implementing systems and processes. And as these systems and processes involve third parties more and more, you're designing how the data flows both within your organization and out to those third parties, and designing it to be, and you are designing that to be built to minimize privacy risk. You can't do that, and you can't do that design without an understanding of the risks involved to that third party, both in terms of understanding their overall maturity and posture, the various threats that they may pose, both in terms of security and their own internal use of the data. And those considerations can drive how you design the integration of that third party into whatever processes or software or systems that you're designing. Additionally, as part of privacy by design, you should be identifying any in-scope third parties as you're building out those data flows and ensuring that they've been assessed, that the type of data, the actions you're taking with the data, et cetera, those inherent risks are associated with the processing activity and taken into account in assessing the risk of the third party itself.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. That resonates certainly with what we're seeing in the market right now. Nick, I'll kind of flip over to you. What's your thoughts on ways in which a privacy-aware TPRM strategy can provide a competitive advantage for our organizations?
Love to take that one. So it's an interesting idea of how do you get an actual competitive advantage out of a privacy by design program within TPRM, and I think it breaks down into three core buckets. The first is just a prioritization of consumer and brand trust. Whenever we're looking at privacy as kind of a top line issue and we relate it to risk, there's inherently a relationship with reputational risk. And so the preservation of your brand reputation is paramount. The estimates vary, but depending who you look at, about 25% of a total brand evaluation is based on reputation. Nothing to do with the financials of the company, purely reputation. And so when you think of it that way, a quarter of your company's value is based on protecting things like privacy. And so building that foundationally and by design into your TPRM solution of when you're engaging with third parties, and kind of think of it as not third parties, but your extended enterprise, your extended true extensions of your own organization. If they get breached, if they get busted, that's going to come back and affect your reputation and your consumer trust as you go to work with consumers, work with other companies. So that protection as a competitive advantage is one piece of it. I think from a pure process standpoint, faster time to value and faster onboarding of vendors. This is one of the big meters we emphasize when we're bringing folks onto the OneTrust platform. Is we want to do everything we can to enable you to onboard a new third party more quickly. It just increases business velocity. It helps you solve the problems you're setting out to solve. And one of the ways we can do that from a privacy by design approach is making sure we're not doing redundant work. So often we see a privacy team sending out separate impact assessments, and then an information security team sending out a separate security assessment, and then there might be an ethics and compliance assessment, and then there might be XYZ, 5 more things, and the third party is overwhelmed. They don't know where to start, and so everything stops. And so if, as from a software solution standpoint, we can streamline all that, we can consolidate and automate all of that, that helps you scale and onboard the third parties you need to use faster while protecting the essential data that you need to protect. And then I think the third part of this is actually a bit of a flip, and it's all about making sure that you have the rights to use the data you already have for marketing and customer experience enablement. As I mean, in many cases like this, a partnership Capco OneTrust to Capco One, or to OneTrust, Capco is a third party, to Capco OneTrust is a third. And so, in the very nature of our thought leadership, but also it's a marketing activity. This is a webinar; it's a marketing activity. That data of everyone who's attending today, we need to make sure as a company that both companies are aligned on how we're going to use it, so that in the future we can reuse it responsibly. And so we're very much aligned on how we're going to do that. Obviously, we're talking through that, but you can imagine a situation where that's not true, and a company collects all sorts of data through various marketing channels, through various third parties, but they don't actually make sure that in the collection of all that personal data, they're securing the opt-in rights to reuse it, to retarget, to add to marketing campaigns, to enhance customer experiences, whatever that may be. And that's a huge value add for your company's marketing department. For any of the future outreach you need to do, if you can't collect that consent and collect that from a kind of a privacy by design system through your third-party risk management, well, you've collected all this data and there's nothing you can do with it. So you spent a lot of money and you're not going to get much of an ROI out of it.
No, really thoughtful response. I appreciate that. There was at least a couple carrots and sticks in that response. And certainly, I think everybody listening has probably gotten some good takeaways from that. So thank you, Nick. Appreciate that. Andy, maybe round us out here. So how does a data-centric approach to TPRM differ from what would be considered a traditional compliance-driven approach?
So modern modern third-party risk management really does rely on real-time data and analytics to be able to assess and monitor your vendor risks and threats. So we're collecting real-time threat intelligence on our vendors. We're looking at their reputational risks and their performance metrics to make decisions about, whether or not the risks presented by those third parties will impact our businesses. We advise our clients in the financial services sector. There are regulations out there that make you accountable for your vendors' risks. So their risks become your risks if not managed correctly. So in addition to the preliminary due diligence and the good contracts, to make sure that your vendors understand what their responsibilities are, you should continuously monitor your vendors. Tools like OneTrust help with the sort of real-time risk reporting and the analytics that are necessary for us to be able to make continuous risk-based decisions on our vendor portfolio and individual vendors. Of course, being able to act proactively and manage those risks requires that each company has run books, playbooks that are ready to go for various types of risks that you might face.
Excellent.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So I appreciate the robust set of answers across the panel on this one. That's a really good start to this conversation. And with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right into our next poll question. So if everyone would follow suit as we did the first time, poll question number two is, which aspect of privacy by design do you find most challenging to integrate into your third-party risk management? We'll give 30 seconds or less here and go ahead and collect those responses. All right, should be wrapping up and get our responses back here. All right, pretty overwhelming response here on number two. So ensuring continuous privacy oversight throughout the third-party lifecycle seems to be what most folks find challenging in TPRM management. So that absolutely makes sense. And again, resonates, I think, with what we see with clients out in the market. So thank you all for the response back on that. Let's go ahead and move into our second topic. So what we'll be doing here is talking about how to visualize and understand data sprawl across the service provider landscape. So the first question I'll kick to you, Nick, which is, how can organizations effectively map out and visualize data sprawl across their third-party landscape?
So I will start with what is hopefully actually a pretty easy win here. And that is, if you're managing a third-party risk management program, and I realize many people on the line are probably coming to this actually from a privacy team or from a privacy program, but someone out there is leading the day-to-day management of your third-party risk management program. And what they need is a good map, a good data map. And hopefully someone in your organization has already created that. And that is a great starting point to see where data is moving throughout your organization and where those exit points are for where data may be leaving your organization and going to third parties. One of the things we encounter all the time is that organizations actually, you think it'd be very simple. Okay, we've got our internal data map. We've got our whole third-party ecosystem. Let's just match them up. What we actually find a lot is that when you do go to match those up, you find places where you actually have kind of shadow IT vendors, different shadow vendors who data is leaving the organization. We have that in our data map, but there's actually no third-party record of who it's going to or what sort of assessment was done towards them. And so there's this mapping exercise that has to happen right off the top of making sure your internal data map and then your third-party inventory is completely mapped. And then the tricky thing is that third-party ecosystem does become very hard to manage because it is inherently changing, first of all, but it's also changing within the construct of each individual third-party relationship. So it's not as simple as, oh, we send this data set to this third party. That'd be great. If that's all we had to do, we'd all be golden. I wouldn't have to have this webinar. We'd be all set. But think of the things that have changed with probably half your vendors in the last 6 months to a year. How many of them from software side of the equation, if we're talking software vendors, have added some sort of AI functionality? Are you aware that they've added that functionality? Are you aware of what model they've built it on? Are you aware of whether or not they're using the data you send them to train that model? What are the training protocols of all of these different things? And that evolution, obviously AI in that case is an extreme example, but that's the sort of thing that, and everyone kind of keyed in on this as the key challenge over that life cycle, being able to track that is the hardest part. And so what we see is a lot of organizations starting to inject within their contracting language standard clauses around evolution of the relationship from a data protection standpoint. And so that can be things as simple as, hey, if you're going to start using any sort of AI, you need to notify us with this much lead time. You need to tell us about the type of model, what it's being used for, all of that sort of stuff. And so that's something we're starting to see be more and more common. And then the other thing I think that really helps with that is what we've talked about is engagement-based TPRM. And engagement-based TPRM actually is much simpler than just going vendor by vendor, because vendor by vendor, you don't actually have the business context. So if you can build your program specific to each engagement and kind of assess based on the engagement, you inherently have a leg up on why we're engaging with this vendor. And if you can take why we're engaging with this vendor and align it to should we or should we not be giving them this data? Should we in the future allow them to use a sub-processor that changes the nature of that and the risks of that relationship? It always gives you that business context of what is the problem we're trying to solve versus what is the vendor we are working with. And that's actually the more important question in how you rationalize where data should or should not be moving, because it comes back to a fundamental business challenge.
That's great, Nick. I think very relevant coverage on, AI models and, what we're seeing significant uptick with, most of our client base right now. So I appreciate that response. Emily, I'll turn to you. What risks do unchecked data sprawl introduce into an organization's data protection and privacy efforts?
I mean, overall, the biggest problem is it just makes everything a lot more difficult. To start with, it introduces significant visibility problems. So you can't control what's happening with your data if you don't know where it is or who's using it or what they're using it for. It also makes process integrations to actually ensure that reviews are being done, that uses of that data is authorized. Basically, you lose all of the different kind of you start losing the kinds of usable choke points or review triggers that you would typically use to make sure that something is kicked into that review. These things tend to then lead into a couple of different issues. Difficulty in meeting privacy principles and requirements. So if you don't know what's going on with the data, you can't provide adequate transparency. You can't ensure that its use is being limited to appropriate purposes. You can't control as easily what third parties it's going out to. And when you get to some of the more paperwork-based stuff, it makes it much harder to maintain records of your processing activities and to perform the required analyses that you have to do. It also just overall increases the threat profile that you're looking at. So if data has sprawled in an uncontrolled way, there are more places where a security incident could cause a material data loss. There are more vendors acting as potential threat vectors. So overall, yeah, the general theme on that is it just increases the complexity and difficulty and threat profile that you're facing, as compared to an organization that has a much more visible and controlled view on what data it has, where what it's being used for, and who has access to it.
Excellent. No, thank you for those insights, Emily. And I think that works nicely into our next topic. So we're going to move into topic number 3, which is talking about assessing threats and risks presented by TPRM providers to inform risk mitigation decisions. So my first question, Andy, I'll tee up for you, which is what are the key factors to consider when assessing the risk posed by TPRM service providers?
Well, so the interesting thing is in past lives prior to AI, we were typically thinking about third-party service providers as using our data or data that we shared with them. Now, as we're engaging with AI providers, they are actually providing a lot of the training data that went in to train the model is typically sourced by the third party. And so we want to make sure that those AI providers are using that data ethically, responsibly, that they are allowed to use that data, that any data that's shared with us is legal and ethical, and that we're not violating those sorts of capabilities or the terms and conditions of use there. But then, there are also still sort of the more typical third parties, which still by and large make up the majority of our service providers. So cloud service providers are probably the biggest vendors that we see in financial services sector. So, and we want to make sure that whoever we partner up with is capable of sustaining our business responsibilities for the long haul. So we're looking for partners who demonstrate strong financial stability and operational resilience capabilities, that they are able to demonstrate strong security and privacy safeguards, that are displayed, that are first demonstrated via fair contract terms and strong commitments to service level agreements. We want to make sure that they're ethically using the data that we share with them responsibly, that they're not using it for other purposes other than what we have shared it. The primary processing, the reason we've gone to the vendor. We want to make sure that our partners maintain strong reputational standing, because we don't want to have any data breaches that backfire on us. We've all seen the repercussions of downstream data breaches and misuse of data and unsecure, unsafe software. It's blown up, and we're trying to stave off those risks.
Yeah, certainly. Well, thank you for that, Andy. Appreciate it. Emily, I'll kick back to you. How can organizations develop a consistent framework for assessing risks across their various third-party relationships?
So for me, this in general comes down to not wanting to reinvent the wheel. There are framework approaches out there. For example, I'm sure most on the call are familiar with NIST and the NIST risk management framework, which does provide language and a common framework for looking at risk more generally. Which ultimately, when we're talking about third-party risk, when we're talking about privacy by design and the kinds of mitigations that you're wanting to build in as you're examining your different processing activities. Ultimately, these become risk questions because you could, in theory, lock things down to the nth degree so that there is no risk, but then you get no business done. And instead, you have to take a look at how these different risks stack up alongside any of the other relevant business risks as you're trying to design whatever activity it is that you're going with. I tend to lean pretty heavily into some of those industry framework approaches for a variety of reasons. One is because, well, somebody else has already done that work. I don't need to redo it. But also because the further you go into having a highly unique or customized framework, the harder it is to live with over the years as time moves on. So as new risks come into place, you're finding yourself having to, whether it's one that you develop yourself or like a unique vendor tie-in that has just their own specific way of doing things. As you're getting to major updates, just the work and the thrash of trying to figure that out, if it's something that you built incredibly custom, ends up almost swallowing a lot of the benefits of what you're originally trying to capture with that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love the response. We tend to hang our hat pretty significantly on NIST here at Capco as well, so that definitely resonates with us and the team. So Nick, what role does automation play in keeping TPRM programs up to date with evolving regulatory requirements?
So I think the key aspect here from an automation, and these are, I'll call it two ends of the spectrum here, because we primarily at OneTrust view automation as a very kind of process optimization speed tool. But automation can be used from that regulatory upkeep perspective. And it all comes down to using automation to ensure that you are continually monitoring and continuing to assess. We've actually kind of had to retrain a lot of folks internally here as we've evolved some things product-wise to think differently between what is an assessment versus what is a questionnaire. On a questionnaire, they've been almost synonymous for years. People use them interchangeably, and it makes sense why. Because the questionnaire for many years has been the primary tool of how you assess third parties. And the questionnaire is not going away, and the NIST framework's not going away, and how you build off of that's all a great foundation. But being able to use automation rules and customizations to build workflows that automatically check in on a third party and pull outside in data. So there's all sorts of risks rating data. To Andy's point earlier, talking through the financial risk scores. We have a partner in Rapid Ratings who we can pull scores in off to see, okay, financial solvency and stability, and that's a big indicator. So being able to pull in that sort of work without having to send a questionnaire to that third party and continually updating just the amount of data and the amount of knowledge you have about third party lets you keep that data source up to date for when there is a regulatory change. So when the requirements change and the compliance requirements change, you don't have to go back out now and say, oh, I have to go reassess all 300 vendors. Here's this 300 question questionnaire. Guess what? You're not going to be compliant for another 2 years after that. So how can you continually refresh using various automation rules and data inputs to make sure that when those regulatory changes happen, you're ready to comply.
That's great, Nick. Yeah, and we understand that to be one of the fundamental superpowers of the OneTrust platform. So I appreciate you going through that detail. Fantastic. So great conversation there, but it's time to move into our third polling question. So we can go ahead and put that up on screen. And the question is, what is one of the challenges your organization's facing in automating TPRM processes? So we'll give 30 seconds or so for folks to go ahead and answer that one. We'll look at the results. All right, so hopefully everyone's gotten a response in by now. We'll see what we're looking like. Okay, so look, we've got a couple, sort of front runners here. So the first is balancing automation efficiency with accurate privacy assessments. That makes sense at 50% of the responses. And then the second or biggest response is integrating automated workflows with existing TPRM frameworks. Absolutely, makes sense. Thank you all for the response back on that. So let's go ahead and jump into topic number 4. And so what we're going to be doing here is learning how automation enterprise tools like OneTrust can automate third-party management from initial intake to risk assessment, mitigation, ongoing monitoring, and reporting. So Nick, the OneTrust man, I'm going to go ahead and start this off with you. How can organizations balance the use of automation with the need for human oversight in managing high-risk TPRM relationships?
Yeah, so it's an important balance, and I like to think of it as automation, if done correctly, is what allows you to focus on those high risk engagements. So, say for nice round numbers, you've got 1,000 third parties in your ecosystem. Chances are 50 of those, give or take, are actually truly critical. If they went down, it would be a bad day for your company. And so what can we do to build automated processes across the third-party risk lifecycle that allow your actual human staffed resources to go work with those 50 third parties to make sure you're doing everything you can to identify and mitigate the risks they actually pose. And what that actually means from a process standpoint, the way we like to break it down is if we think of those 1,000 and we strip out, okay, 50 of those we've identified as absolute business critical and or have a higher risk, inherent risk profile. And so we're going to stick them on a semi-automated, but overall pretty manual intensive due diligence process. And then there's going to be another 100 who are in that middle ground. And we're going to go, this is actually a great place to use a lot of automation tools to bring in a lot of insight without having to go collect it manually. So we're rolling out a document ingestion engine where we're going to be able to scan SOC 2 reports, scan all sorts of attestations, privacy policy documents. So if they have a full written up privacy policy and they're willing to give that to you, you can ingest it straight into the platform. And the automation engine and the NLP engine in that will spin it straight back onto whatever framework you're using from a questionnaire perspective. So say you're using the SIG-Lite, which I know maps quite well in terms of the NIST frameworks, it will, give or take, a SOC 2 will answer about half of that. And so you immediately have automation pulling in a level of due diligence that you'd have to go bug that third party for. You'd have to go over time, try and get them to answer, try to get quality answers, and then automated risk flagging after that. Okay, let's look at these answers compared to normative answers and let's automatically flag risk. Let's kick off mitigation workflows, kind of kick off those automated jobs to be done workflows. So that at the middle level, and then at the top line level, it is, okay, what level of data can we pull in for those last, I don't remember exactly what my numbers were, but those last 800 who are not that critical to our business and not that risky. Well, how do we do general screening on them? And how do we have as little human touch in that relationship as possible? So we preserve our resources to focus on the deep dives we need to do with the highest risk third parties.
No, fantastic. Great perspective on that. So thank you. Appreciate all that detail. Emily, I'm going to kind of switch gears here a little bit and go to you next. One thing I know our clients have been asking about recently is how cyber risks introduced by third-party vendors differ from internal risks and how organizations should be adjusting their mitigation strategies to account for those.
Sure. And yeah, that is a really interesting topic these days. With honestly how many organizations' environments are much more blended between internal tools and external third parties. But overall, when I'm thinking about this, I tend to go back to that kind of framework approach I was talking about, where, okay, these are all risks. And when you're looking at what changes, it goes into some of the parameters that you're looking at there, things around what vulnerabilities or predisposing conditions exist, what the threat sources are, what the targeting, what factors go into targeting, to understand how that then impacts how you're evaluating the risks of those vendors. So, and this is stuff that you see in the news, like you'll see major events like the CrowdStrike incident. A couple of years ago, there was an incident where Maersk was the biggest one that got hit by this ransomware attack, but the vector was, if I recall correctly, some software introduced by their accounting firm. So these service providers may have a very different present a very different threat profile than actors going against an organization directly would. It also has significant impacts on things like visibility and mitigation. So internally, you do have a lot more visibility in what's going on in your environment than you can on a service provider. You can always you can always do all the diligence that you want in the world, make sure they have all of the right external certifications and reports, fill out lengthy questionnaires, but there will always be a visibility gap there, which is something that has to be taken into account as far as when and where and what data you're sending that you're sending around, as well as how you can respond in the event of an incident at a third party that impacts your data. And a lot of this runs in parallel to a lot of the movement we've seen in the security space in recent years, where you start looking at some of the newer generations of tools for securing your cloud footprint. But where those starts to get really interesting, and where I start turning towards that data-driven approach, is taking some of those different tools that exist out there and using them to help me make sure that I have a really good handle on my cloud footprint. So, for example, in the OneTrust context, where you have something like the different modules speaking to each other, and you're able to cross-leverage data that you're getting from your questionnaires, and internally, when you're doing a privacy impact assessment or a data inventory, you can cross-reference that against other data from other sources, where by pulling that data that already exists in your organization out, using it to make sure that where you're doing these analyses, you have identified everyone that's in scope. That's how you can start to keep up with it. And in general, bringing both in terms of identifying the third parties and identifying what data is going where. By turning a lens on all that data that already exists in your organization, you can really start to build a much more automated and much more comprehensive mitigation strategy across your footprint.
Great insights and guidance as well, how organizations should be thinking about this. And you reminded me of some painful travel experience on the heels of CrowdStrike a few months ago. I thought I was over that, but that was not a good time. So good response there. Andy, I'm going to go to you for a second here. How can automated workflows improve the accuracy and timeliness of risk assessments for third-party providers?
Well, anytime that we can apply rules-based automation to the due diligence process, it should speed up and shorten the time to assess and onboard vendors. We've seen marked improvements in speed, ability to scale at many of our clients when they can apply sort of, again, rules-based decision making, where you've got your risk thresholds predetermined, You're removing human error and manual processes, manual risk assessment processing, eliminating bias from decision making. So you're just going straight by the data that's presented to you. We have seen, as I said, tremendous throughput on all those fronts. And then we can report it out accurately. We can report at the process level and then at the program level, where senior management then can see how the benefits that have been brought about by sort of automated processing with using tools like OneTrust for third-party risk management. I think that pretty much covers it.
No, excellent. No, thank you, Andy. That's very thorough and helpful. So yeah, so while we're we've just wrapped our kind of core questions or topics, I should say, for the webinar. I'd like to encourage. I know we've put a message into the chat. If anyone has any questions they'd like to pose to the panel, now is a good time to do that. While you're maybe thinking about of some whoppers to put in there, we'll go ahead and move into a couple canned questions that we had ahead of time that we think would be interesting for people to hear about. So, Nick, I'll start with you. What are the main obstacles you see in adopting a privacy by design approach to TPRM?
I think one of the big ones, and especially in financial services, is the regulatory and regional variability. When you look at a global landscape and you look at what has changed just in the last 6 months, or even what is coming up on January 17th with DORA going into practice in full force, the requirements, state by state, country by country, continent by continent, vary wildly. And so I think being able to, one of the hardest things is, how do you consolidate that down, and how do you bake that into, okay, what are the 10 best practices that I need to institute from a privacy by design standpoint that are actually going to, first of all, from a privacy perspective, protect the data I'm out to protect, making sure it's used correctly, used responsibly, but also, how do I go about making sure that I'm building my best practice program so that when a regulation changes, when regulation evolves, I'm equipped to go evolve with it because I'm doing the right things already. And the bridge between, okay, what do we need to be doing, and regulatory compliance and building that privacy by design approach, there's a happy middle ground. But actually getting to that is one of the hardest things, and that's going to just take, honestly, a lot of work. It's a great opportunity to talk to the folks at Capco of how do they advise from a governance standpoint that you should approach it based on your regional specificity, based on the industry you play in, and where you're moving data to. It's going to vary so much that it's a big governance exercise, but when you get it right, the things it makes easy on the end from a compliance standpoint, from a change management standpoint, are incredible.
No, that's excellent, Nick. Yeah, the ever shifting sands of the regulatory landscape. We have folks here at Capco that love to read all of the new regs coming out, so that you don't have to. So thanks for the little pitch on our services there. That helps a lot. So, Andy, I'll kind of kick off to you here. Given the increasing reliance on third-party vendor platforms for key business functions, what are the most critical privacy by design considerations that organizations should prioritize when selecting and integrating these types of platforms?
Well, if you're talking about privacy by design, obviously the first thing that comes to mind is data protection. If you're going to share data with the third, do they have commitments to limit the access to the data and the use of that data? Do they have the capabilities to be able to obfuscate the personal information so that they can mitigate things like insider threat and misuse? Do they encrypt the data? Most of the regulations that we deal with, almost all of the security and data protection regulations, require strong encryption. And we're seeing the increasing use of other privacy enhancing technologies to help to obfuscate and protect that personal information. particularly in transit and in processing. Good data lifecycle management capabilities, so they will be able to meet our data retention or retention requirements, and then they'll delete the data upon demand, either at the termination of the contract or, another thing is downstream compliance sort of stuff. When a data subject comes to us, or an individual comes to us, sorry, I'm acting as the financial institution. And they say, we want to know what data you've got on us, or we want you to delete data out of your systems. Can the third party, the service provider, also accept and acknowledge and enable that request? Will they delete it? We've seen cases where there are plenty of vendors, particularly in the MarTech space, that just won't do that. And so that is a risk that we commonly advise our clients on. And then also finally the vendor lifecycle management sort of capabilities. That's really more about the governance of that. We want to continue to manage the vendor performance. We want to monitor their risks and threats. And then we also want the ability to be able to terminate the relationship in the event that the vendor doesn't abide by its commitments or presents risk that exceeds our risk tolerance threshold. We want to make sure that there are exit clauses in the contracts and the ability to take our data and move it to a different service provider. And that's commonly required in most of the guidelines and regulations that we deal with in the financial services sector.
Amazing insight there, Andy. Appreciate that. Emily, maybe to you, how have you found that the use of AI by suppliers impacts third-party risk management? That was covered a little bit by Nick up front, but I'm interested in your perspective as well.
Sure. And this is an interesting one because fundamentally you're still looking at, okay, what data does the supplier have? What are they going to do with it? What does their maturity look like, etc. So a lot of the fundamental questions aren't different, but it's a big enough change that it is managing to wreak some havoc around the edges. We're in an environment now where suppliers are more data hungry than ever. They're constantly seeking additional rights in data for use in models. You have employees that are hungry to use these tools because they do represent tremendous increases in capabilities and tremendous savings. So what you're seeing is things change that you were used to being in a somewhat stable configuration previously. So you're getting new options and configurations within the tools that you already have, where everyone seems to be trying to cram in AI functionality into their existing tools. As well as people just seeking review and onboarding of new tools entirely. So what that does, it does increase the need for ensuring that you are doing a regular review of suppliers from a TPRM perspective. But the bigger difference is what that does in terms of change management. So because this use case can differ a little bit, there is risk of these changes not being caught, or the types of uses that they're considering just being something that's not part of how vendors are assessed at that part of the life cycle. So what I've had to do is really dig into how change management is handled and making sure that the appropriate reviews are triggered, that people throughout the organization even know what to be looking for, because you're getting to a situation where an admin clicking a minor change inside of a configuration portal will be giving the supplier radically different rights in your potentially sensitive data. So on that, it really does, for me, it does call for looking much more granularly at how your TPRM activities are integrated into your processes, what data you're using to back up your ability to see what's going on inside those applications, and also the need for training, because ultimately there are going to be some gaps. But if you do have your individuals who are out on the front line trained to know when to ask questions, when they need to be coming to you, you're able to catch more of these things and continue to adjust your program as you go.
Great perspective. Thank you on that. So we do actually have a question from the audience. And so continuing with the AI and Gen AI theme, I'll go ahead and read this one out, and I'll leave it to our panelists who wants to take this, or maybe all three will have a response. So here's a question. What best practices or frameworks would you recommend to ensure that Gen AI powered initiatives remain compliant while fostering innovation? And there's a bit of a part two to that. As AI practices continue to evolve, how can organizations proactively adapt to regulatory change while scaling AI solutions for sustained compliance and long-term growth? There's a lot there. So I would have you guys take a crack at it, and hopefully we can get some insights for the audience.
Hey, I'm happy to go first here. So I will say from the practices and frameworks perspective, there's not a lot there yet. There is the NIST AI framework. It's a great starting place. But you're not going to see, like you do in the rest of the third-party cybersecurity market, you're not going to see 40 different frameworks that dig into all the subtle nuances. Not yet. We're not there yet. The market's just not mature. It hasn't caught up from a framework standpoint. But the NIST AI framework is a great starting place. And what I would recommend, and obviously this is a balance of risk versus innovation, as it always is. How much risk are you willing to take on for the benefits of whatever that AI empowers your organization to do? But I always like to think of it, and this goes back to Andy's answer earlier, this is a data governance issue. No matter what the AI models, ignore what the AI model could be, what it could do, any of the risks associated with it. If from an internal data governance standpoint, you have your house in order, you are leaps and bounds ahead of most people. And so if you can get that under control and you know exactly what you're going to basically expose to any model that comes your way, that's a huge advantage and a huge starting point. The next step is you need to be looking model by model of what are the risks that these different models pose. So from the Gen AI perspective, we can get into risks of inherent bias. We can get into hallucinogenic risks. We can get into risks in terms of data usage that it saves data that it shouldn't be saving, all sorts of things like that. And so there are inventories. OneTrust is scaling our AI governance product to support some of this that have kind of that model card library. Here are the risks associated with it, kind of a simplified scoring mechanism, 0 to 5 on how risky this is, inherent bias of the model, things like that. Lots of different options out there in the market that are starting to take shape. That's a great starting point. I do also think it comes back to using AI responsibly. A lot of the times means not using AI. I have this conversation with my product team all the time of we're getting pressured from all sorts of things, even just from a competitive market. It'd be great to say we use AI to do all this, this, and this, because that's sexy, that sounds good, that helps sell product. But I can't with a straight face go to my customers and say, hey, we put AI into this to optimize this process, when a really simple automation rule would do it just fine with 2 little levers. Turns out, you know what? We don't need AI in everything. And so being really diligent and looking at what is the business need, and is there a way to, for right now, not use AI and get 95% of the results? That's a business decision-making process that immediately cuts your risk from 100 to 0 because you're not using AI. And so I realize I kind of went on a bit of a tangent there, but it's a really nuanced conversation because we're just not there from a maturity curve perspective. We're only scratching the surface here of the risks and the potential.
Yeah. One thing.
Emily,
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
One thing that I would add on to that, though, is if we're talking about like what kinds of frameworks we're looking at for Gen AI powered initiatives, to me, this is going back to the same thing I've been hammering all along, is okay, no, it all fundamentally boils down to risk. And what a lot of these, when you're looking at these issues posed by AI, a lot of it is because they're breaking our traditional risk models. That doesn't necessarily mean that the way that we do risk is wrong. It's that we haven't updated how we're looking at threats, how we're looking at vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. How these changes, this is a change in the environment, which can be put through many of the same tools and processes. We just need to make sure that the way that our tools and processes are set up has actually been updated for how the reality on the ground has changed.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So fantastic perspectives from everyone. Thank you for that question. I think that's a topic we could spend another 90 minutes on if we needed to. A little bit of levity. I was playing golf with a friend a couple of weeks ago and had to make fun of him because his golf driver said now with AI technology. And so back to Nick's point, everybody's stuffing AI into everything on the planet right now.
I'd
And
say that's a pretty low risk use case.
that's right. That's right. All right. Well, look, hey, this was a fantastic conversation. Hopefully everyone on the phone today got some good takeaways and things to think about within their organization. I want to thank our panelists, Emily, Andy, and Nick. If I didn't hammer on this point at the front, obviously Capco and OneTrust go to market together pretty closely, and we're strategic partners for each other. So Nick, we appreciate all your insights, particularly from the TPRM side of what you do on the OneTrust platform. We will be sharing this webinar out after the call within the next couple of days. And so that link will go out to all our attendees, and you can revisit any of the particulars that you might have missed today. Thank you all for attending, and really appreciate all the insights from our panel. Thanks, everyone.